He mocked the black security guard in front of everyone. 30 minutes later, he was begging on his knees. The private tech campus looked more like a luxury resort than an office building. Marble floors, glass walls, exotic cars lined up outside like trophies. At the front gate stood David Carter, a black security guard in his early 40s. His uniform was neat, his posture straight, his eyes calm. David had worked security for over 15 years. Former military, disciplined, quiet. He believed in respect even when it wasn't returned. That afternoon, a bright red Lamborghini screeched to a stop in front of the gate. Out stepped Evan Blake, an 18-year-old millionaire's son. Designer clothes, diamond watch, smirk glued to his face. David raised a hand politely. "Good afternoon, sir. May I see your access badge?" Evan laughed. "You serious?" he said loudly. "You think someone like me needs permission from someone like you?" A few employees slowed their steps. Phones came out. Whispers began. David stayed calm. "Company policy, sir." Evan's smile turned cruel. Evan leaned closer, invading David's personal space, his expensive cologne sharp and deliberate, the kind meant to announce power before words ever did. His lips curled into a smile that wasn't playful but practiced, the kind learned early by people who had never been told no. "Let me guess," Evan said, lowering his voice just enough to make it sting, just enough so it felt personal. "High school dropout, living paycheck to paycheck, guarding gates while people like me run the world." David could feel the eyes already shifting toward them, curiosity blooming like a bruise about to surface. Evan straightened suddenly and raised his voice, projecting confidence like a performer who knew the crowd was ready. "Hey everyone," he called out. "This guy thinks he's important." Laughter erupted instantly, sharp, careless, cruel. A few people laughed because it was funny, others because it was easier than staying silent. David caught movement from the corner of his eye, someone lifting a phone, then another. A red recording light blinked to life. The moment was being archived, packaged, prepared for strangers who would never know his name but would recognize his humiliation. David felt the familiar pressure in his chest, not anger, not rage. It was heavier than that. It was dignity being peeled away in public, layer by layer, without permission. He had felt it before, at job interviews that ended too quickly. At parent-teacher meetings where assumptions were made before questions were asked. At family gatherings where success was measured loudly and failure whispered. He swallowed and kept his voice steady. "I'm just doing my job," David said quietly, the words chosen with care, like stepping across thin ice. Evan laughed again, louder this time, feeding off the reaction. "Your job," he repeated, dragging the words out. "You should be thanking me. My father owns half the companies in this city." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick wad of cash, and tossed it onto the ground between them. The bills scattered slightly, some brushing against David's boots. "Here," Evan said, "buy yourself some pride." The laughter died instantly, even the phones hesitated. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable, the kind that made people suddenly aware of where they were standing. David stared at the money. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to define his worth with currency, but it never stopped cutting. His mind flickered, not to anger but to memory. His mother working double shifts with blistered hands. His father leaving before dawn, coming home after dark, exhausted but still teaching him how to stand straight. Pride, they had said, was the one thing no one could take unless you handed it over. David slowly lifted his gaze and met Evan's eyes. There was no fire there, no challenge. Just calm, measured, unreadable. For a moment, Evan's smile wavered, as if he'd expected something else, an outburst, a plea, a reaction he could dominate. Instead, David stepped back deliberately, creating space. He didn't bend. He didn't reach for the money. He didn't raise his voice. "You may enter," David said calmly, his tone professional, controlled, final. Evan blinked, then smirked, relief and triumph mixing together. "Thought so," he said, brushing past David as if the encounter were already beneath him. He walked inside to applause from a few lingering laughs, convinced he had won, unaware that somewhere unseen, systems were shifting, calls were being placed, and consequences were already moving toward him. 30 minutes later, everything would change. But for now, the doors closed behind him, and David stood alone at his post, dignity intact, waiting. Inside the executive floor, Evan strutted into the boardroom like someone entering a stage built for him. The room was all glass and steel, a skyline stretching behind it like proof of dominance. He adjusted his cufflinks, chin raised, expecting the usual reactions, nods of respect, polite smiles, maybe even admiration. Instead, conversations stopped mid-sentence. Chairs stilled. A silence settled that wasn't welcoming but cautious. A senior executive near the head of the table frowned openly. "Why are you here?" he asked, not bothering to hide his irritation. Evan chuckled, waving a hand as if the question itself were amusing. "My dad sent me," he said casually, "said I should observe, learn how things work." A few executives exchanged glances. The frown deepened. "Your father," the executive said slowly, choosing his words with care, "didn't mention that." Evan's smile tightened. He opened his mouth to respond, ready with a joke or a dismissive remark, when the heavy boardroom door opened behind him. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Footsteps followed, measured, deliberate, unmistakably authoritative. Evan turned. Mr. Raymond Blake walked in first, Evan's father, the man whose name alone carried weight in this city. But something was wrong immediately. Raymond wasn't smiling. His face was rigid, jaw set, eyes sharp with a kind of focus Evan had rarely seen directed at him. Behind Raymond came the CEO of the entire corporation, followed by the legal director, two compliance officers, and finally David Carter. Evan's breath caught. David was no longer in uniform. No security badge, no gate. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that fit him perfectly, crisp white shirt, calm posture. He didn't look like someone who had been dragged into the room. He looked like someone who belonged there. The boardroom rose instinctively. Chairs scraped. The atmosphere shifted from confusion to unease. Evan felt it then, the first crack in his confidence, thin but unmistakable. "Dad," Evan said, forcing a laugh that sounded strange even to his own ears. "What's going on?" Raymond didn't look at him right away. He took his seat slowly at the head of the table, hands folded, eyes scanning the room before finally locking onto his son. When he spoke, his voice was ice-cold, stripped of warmth, authority sharpened by disappointment. "Sit down." Evan hesitated, then obeyed, lowering himself into a chair that suddenly felt too small. He glanced at David again, searching for an explanation, a mistake, anything that would return control to him. David remained standing near the far end of the table, calm and composed, hands relaxed at his sides. The CEO cleared his throat. "We received a call 30 minutes ago," he said evenly. "Along with video footage." Evan stiffened. "Video?" The legal director slid a tablet onto the table and tapped the screen. Evan watched himself appear, laughing, mocking, tossing cash. The room watched with him. Every word echoed louder than it had outside. The silence afterward was brutal. Raymond didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Do you know who David Carter is?" he asked. Evan swallowed. "He's security." David finally spoke, his voice steady, respectful. "Senior compliance auditor," he corrected. "Assigned undercover." Evan's world tilted. The CEO nodded. "Mr. Carter reports directly to my office and the board. His role is to identify ethical violations, abuse of authority, and reputational risk." Evan's mouth went dry. Raymond leaned forward slightly. "You humiliated a company representative. In public, on camera, you abused perceived power. You exposed us to legal risk." Evan tried to recover. "Dad, it was a joke. People are too sensitive." Raymond's hand hit the table, not hard, but firm enough to end everything. "You embarrassed yourself," he said quietly, "and you embarrassed me." Evan shrank. The legal director spoke again. "Effective immediately, Evan Blake is removed from all observer privileges, barred from company property, and will issue a formal public apology." Raymond didn't look away from his son. "And you will attend leadership remediation, or you will not represent this family again." Evan opened his mouth, but no words came. David remained standing, dignity intact, eyes steady, not triumphant, not vengeful, just present. The balance of power had shifted completely. Evan understood it then, too late. He hadn't been important at the gate, and he wasn't important here either. The CEO spoke first, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to ending conversations with a single sentence. "Evan, the man you humiliated at the gate is David Carter." Evan let out a short, nervous laugh, the sound hollow even to his own ears. "So," he said quickly, trying to keep control, "he's security." "No," the CEO interrupted sharply, the words slicing through the room. "He is head of corporate security and risk assessment. Board-level advisor, former military intelligence, personally hired by me." The color drained from Evan's face so fast it was almost visible, like blood retreating under sudden pressure. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Around him, executives sat frozen, the implications settling in one by one. David Carter was not a nameless guard. He was not background. He was authority, experience, and consequence embodied in one calm presence. David finally spoke, his voice even measured, devoid of triumph. I requested to work gate duty today, he said, not as punishment, not as disguise, as observation. He paused briefly, letting the words land. I wanted to see how employees and guests treat those they believe are beneath them. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Raymond Blake's jaw tightened, muscles flexing as his hands slowly curled into fists on the table. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but heavy with restrained fury. You threw money at him, Raymond said. You insulted him, you embarrassed this company. Evan shook his head rapidly, panic setting in. It was just a joke, he stammered. People joke all the time, it wasn't serious. David reached into his jacket and slid a phone across the polished table surface. The sound of it stopping felt louder than it should have. This is why I never assume, David said calmly. I document. He tapped the screen. The video began to play. Evan's voice filled the room, amplified and cruel. The insults sounded worse indoors, stripped of the crowd noise that had once masked their weight. Laughter echoed from the recording, sharp and ugly. The moment with the cash played in slow, brutal clarity. Every word, every smirk, every second of entitlement preserved. No one spoke. No one moved. The video ended, and the silence that followed crushed down on Evan's chest like a physical force. The CEO folded his hands. This footage has already been reviewed by compliance, he said, and legal. The legal director nodded. The potential reputational damage is severe, she added, especially given the public nature of the incident. Raymond finally looked at his son fully, disappointment etched deep into his expression. Do you understand what you did? He asked. Evan swallowed hard, his confidence completely gone now. I didn't know who he was, Evan whispered. David's eyes lifted slightly. That, he said, is exactly the problem. The CEO leaned back. Mr. Carter's role is to identify risk, he said. You became one. Evan flinched. Raymond exhaled slowly, as if forcing himself to remain controlled. You thought power meant you could humiliate someone, Raymond said. You thought status meant immunity. He shook his head. You were wrong. David remained standing throughout it all, posture straight, expression steady. There was no satisfaction in his face, only resolve. I didn't stand there to catch you, he said. I stood there to confirm something. Evan looked up weakly. Confirm what? David met his eyes. The character reveals itself most clearly when it believes no consequences exist. The words hung in the air like a verdict. Evan understood then that this moment was not about punishment alone. It was about exposure, and nothing terrified him more than being truly seen. Room was silent, except for the faint hum of the city far below the glass walls. Raymond Blake rose slowly from his seat at the head of the table, his movement deliberate, controlled, each motion weighted with authority. The boardroom, once a place of casual power and predictable hierarchy, now felt like a courtroom, every eye fixed, every mind alert. Raymond's gaze cut through the air and landed on Evan, still slouched in his chair, fingers gripping the edges of the polished wood table, knuckles white. Apologize, Raymond ordered, his voice firm, low, and carrying a weight that made even the senior executives flinch. Evan's eyes darted around the room. Executives, lawyers, cameras, all watching. The walls, the glass, the sleek lines of the modern space suddenly felt like an arena. His heart pounded in his chest. His legs shook under the table. Sweat prickled along his hairline. He had never felt more exposed. He turned toward David Carter, standing statuesque at the far end, eyes calm, unreadable, like a judge presiding over a case that had already been decided. I am sorry, Evan whispered, his voice cracking under the tension. It was a fragile sound, almost swallowed by the space between them. David said nothing. He didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge the apology beyond his unwavering gaze. Raymond's voice, sharp and unyielding, thundered across the room. Not like that. The weight of the command made Evan's stomach churn. He had tried to joke, to bluff, to rely on his inherited confidence, but every instinct in him told him this was different. This was final. He swallowed hard, the taste of panic bitter on his tongue. He glanced at the legal director, at the CEO, at every camera silently recording the moment, and then at his father, whose eyes now burned with something Evan had never seen before, disappointment laced with controlled rage. And then, in a move that shocked even the most seasoned executives in the room, Evan let his chair scrape backward. The polished floor reflected the harsh overhead lights, catching on the slick soles of his shoes as he stood shakily. For a heartbeat, he looked up at David, hoping for some mercy, some flicker of leniency, some acknowledgement that the world might not end here. Then, as if compelled by an invisible force, he bent at the knees, letting them hit the floor with a quiet thud that reverberated in the silent room. He was on his knees before David Carter, exposed, humbled, stripped of every layer of pride and entitlement. "I'm sorry," he said again, voice breaking under the weight of the moment. "I disrespected you. I was wrong." The tears began then, slipping unchecked down his face, glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. He tried to wipe them away, but they kept coming, a physical manifestation of the shame he had ignored all his life until this moment. David finally spoke, his voice calm, controlled, like water cutting through stone. "You didn't mock me because I was a guard," he said evenly. "You mocked me because you thought power belonged only to you, because you believed the world owed you respect, simply because of your name. And when someone showed you that the world does not bend to entitlement, you realized for the first time how fragile your perception of power truly was." Evan's shoulders shook with sobs. He looked at David, desperate for something, anything, a flicker of kindness, an acknowledgement that the lesson had mercy in it. David met his gaze once, long enough to let the words sink, then turned slightly away, voice softening but still firm. "I don't need your apology," he said. "But you will remember this moment for the rest of your life." Raymond Blake cleared his throat. The sound was sharp, commanding attention, slicing through the tension like a knife. He exhaled slowly, his expression unyielding. "Effective immediately," he said, "Evan Blake will be cut off financially. All allowances, privileges, and access to company resources are revoked. He will have no access to company accounts, company properties, or private staff. He is removed from all executive privileges. Furthermore, he will be assigned to work under David Carter's direct supervision for a period of 6 months. This work will be unpaid. Any attempt to circumvent this will be met with immediate legal action. You will report daily. You will follow instructions. You will learn humility." The executives nodded, some taking notes, others just watching silently. The legal director confirmed the orders, ensuring every protocol was clear and documented. Evan's world, once constructed entirely on entitlement and expectation, had crumbled. He had walked into the building thinking he could wield inherited influence like a weapon, and now he knelt, stripped bare in front of everyone, facing not just personal humiliation but institutional authority in its purest form. His knees ached, his hands trembled, and yet, beneath the fear and shame, a seed of understanding began to form, fragile and reluctant. He would remember. He would remember every detail, the way David's eyes never wavered, the calm authority Raymond wielded, the quiet intensity of the CEO, the silence of the boardroom that spoke louder than any rebuke. Every second etched itself into his memory, an indelible mark that would follow him for the rest of his life. And as he remained on his knees, shivering slightly, trying to collect the fragments of his dignity, he realized that power was not granted by name, by wealth, or by lineage. True power, the kind that commands respect without demanding it, the kind that bends even the entitled to recognition, came from integrity, composure, and earned authority. For the first time, Evan Blake understood that lesson and the cost of ignoring it. He bowed his head lower, letting the tears continue to flow, silent in his submission. David turned away completely now, signaling the end of the interaction, leaving Evan to confront the magnitude of his mistakes alone. Raymond exhaled again, tension leaving his shoulders as he observed the moment of reckoning he had orchestrated with precision. Outside, the city continued, unaware that in this skyscraper above, a young man's arrogance had been dismantled, reassembled into a lesson he would never forget. The room was quiet, but the weight of justice, accountability, and personal revelation lingered, tangible and suffocating. And in that silence, Evan understood. For 6 months, every action, every word, every gesture would be observed, measured, and judged under the eye of someone he had once believed he could look down upon. The consequences had begun. 6 months had passed, though it felt both like a lifetime and a single heartbeat depending on who you asked. The sun rose in exactly the same way, casting long shadows across the security gates that now seemed less like barriers and more like thresholds of transformation. Evan Blake stood there, uniform crisp and neat, tie straight, badge polished until it caught the light and reflected it back in precise angles. The same gate where he had once wielded entitlement like a weapon now framed him as a man who had been humbled, reshaped, forged in the quiet crucible of accountability. Each morning, he arrived before the building doors opened, walking past the sleek marble floors of the lobby with measured steps, boots clicking softly but deliberately against the polished surface, a rhythm that spoke of attention, discipline, and a growing respect for his role, no longer a trivial posting, but a responsibility he carried with awareness. David Carter watched him silently from his usual vantage point across the campus, a low perch near the security office that allowed him to observe without interference. There was no smirk on Evan's face anymore, no arrogance hiding behind forced confidence. Each greeting to a visitor, each exchange with employees was measured, polite, and sincere. He held doors, offered directions, checked badges without haste, and spoke without condescension. Laughter from employees now came freely when appropriate, never forced or uneasy. People began to respond to him, not because of fear or expectation, but because of the quiet respect he had cultivated. The same sun that had once witnessed Evan's humiliation now illuminated a different kind of education, the slow, steady erosion of entitlement, replaced by humility earned through sweat, observation, and constant vigilance. Weeks turned into months, and the repetition of the tasks became more than routine, it became ritual. Checking badges wasn't just mechanical anymore. Greeting guests wasn't just a formality. Evan began noticing details he had never considered. A visitor arriving late, stressed, uncertain, a maintenance worker carrying heavy equipment, a colleague navigating a complicated schedule. He began to empathize, to see that his previous arrogance had been rooted in ignorance, in the false assumption that hierarchy equaled inherent superiority. One afternoon, the sky painted in gold and amber as the sun prepared to dip behind the city skyline, Evan approached David Carter at the end of his shift. His gait was measured, confident in the sense of purpose rather than entitlement. "Thank you," he said, voice steady but sincere, eyes meeting David's without hesitation, without fear, without the need for performative defiance. "You didn't destroy me, you fixed me." There was no bravado, no attempt to soften the humility. It was acknowledgement of the lessons learned, acceptance of the accountability imposed, and gratitude for the structure that had corrected his path. David nodded, a faint, approving expression passing across his face. "Power doesn't make a man," he replied, his tone even carrying the weight of truth. "Character does." The words, simple yet profound, resonated beyond the boardroom, beyond the campus, beyond the uniform and the gate. They carried the quiet gravity of wisdom acquired through experience and observation. Evan absorbed the words silently, allowing them to anchor in his mind, to form the framework for the man he would become. He returned to his post at the gate, shoulders straighter now, bearing the weight of responsibility without resentment. His interactions carried calm authority, tempered by respect and genuine concern for others. The gate, once a mere checkpoint, now symbolized something deeper. It was no longer simply a line between inside and outside, between privilege and access. It was a reminder that integrity, humility, and respect were as vital as security protocols and policies. David continued to watch, standing as a sentinel not just over the campus, but over the evolution he had witnessed in a young man who had arrived arrogant, entitled, and untested. Now, Evan's presence at the gate reflected balance, awareness, and the quiet power of earned respect. He greeted a late employee with a smile and a nod, guided a nervous visitor to the proper entrance, and checked identification with care and precision. Each gesture, small on its own, compounded into a tapestry of growth, visible to all who observed closely enough. The campus hummed with life around them, employees moving efficiently, visitors arriving and departing, vehicles navigating smoothly through the gates. Yet in that hum, there was a stillness, a sense that something fundamental had shifted, not in the structures, not in the schedules, not in the building itself, but in the men who occupied the space within it. For the first time, the gate didn't just protect the building. It didn't just enforce rules or maintain security. It protected dignity, respect, and the understanding that privilege without character was hollow, that entitlement without empathy was fragile, and that power without conscience was dangerous. Evan stood, watching the sun sink lower behind the skyline, his shadow stretching across the gates and pavement. The uniform, once a symbol of discipline imposed from above, had become a badge of responsibility accepted from within. He felt it in his chest, a subtle warmth of accomplishment tempered by the memory of past failures, a reminder that growth required both accountability and time. David turned away, eyes scanning the horizon, yet occasionally flicking back to observe the young man who had transformed under his guidance. There was no celebration, no announcement, only the quiet knowledge that lessons had been learned, that a man had been reshaped, and that respect once demanded had finally been earned. As the last employees departed for the day and the campus emptied, the gates closing with a soft, deliberate click, Evan took a deep breath, feeling both relief and responsibility. He was no longer the same person who had arrogantly tossed cash, laughed at others' expense, and believed himself untouchable. The man he had become understood the weight of words, the power of observation, and the consequences of pride unchecked. And as the night settled over the campus, David Carter watched silently, a sentinel not just of security, but of the enduring truth that some of the most important lessons in life are learned not in comfort, but through challenge, humility, and the slow, deliberate rebuilding of character. The gates remained closed for the night, but the lesson would remain open, vivid, and enduring, etched into both their minds, an invisible yet unbreakable boundary safeguarding not only the building, but the essence of what it meant to truly earn respect.